Board member, we are streaming.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to the Board of Education Finance Committee meeting. Meeting. I would like to call this meeting to order. Dr. Albright, may I have a roll call, please?
Ronaldo Tomorito. Heather Benavides.
Here.
Josefina Dominguez.
Here.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Here. Thank you. Our first item is to consider adoption of the February 26, 2025 Finance Committee meeting agenda. May I have a motion and a second?
I move to adopt the February 26, 2025 Finance Committee meeting agenda. Board Member Benavides.
This is Board Member Dominguez. I second.
Thank you. Dr. Albright, may I have a roll call?
Heather Benavides.
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Yes. Thank you. Our next item is to consider approval of the minutes from the Finance Committee meeting on January 22nd, 2025. May I have a motion and a second?
This is Board Member Dominguez. I move to approve the minutes from the Finance Committee meeting on January 22nd, 2025.
And this is Board Member Benavides, and I second that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Albright.
Heather Benavides.
Yep.
Josefina Dominguez.
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Yes. Thank you. Our next item is a discussion of FY26 budget calendar. Our presenters for this is going to be Ms. Apodaca, our Chief Financial Officer, and Ms. Montoya, our Executive Director of Budget and Strategic Planning. And I will turn it over to you, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you, Board Committee, Romero and board members. This item is a discussion item to let you know what we are doing with the FY26 budget. We have a draft calendar in your packet, and this lists some of the activities that happen to develop the budget and the dates, the corresponding dates. Some of them you see that have already happened. For instance, the community meetings happened back in October. Also, we already have rolled out some of the budget development to the schools. We were anticipating an April 15th budget submission to PED. They did notify us yesterday that they were going to give us an extension to May 19th. So there's going to be a little bit of a change on the dates and presentations, and we will get you another calendar. But this is more to give you information on the activities and the dates.
Perfect. Thank you, Ms. Apodaca. I am pleased to hear it. I'm sure you are too, that extension of that deadline. Because that one that they moved it to was super close.
Very.
So members of the committee, do we have any questions on this initial update that Ms. Apodaca provided? I see none. And Ms. Apodaca, I wanted to kind of put this like as a tickler in your brain, and also Superintendent Blakey, as we look at approval for the budget, just ensuring that we are even more, I don't even know if this, I feel like I'm not using correct verbiage here, more closely align it to our goals. Because before, I know we were being, mindful, and we're saying it's goal 1 and goal 2, but to really dive in on how we're going to be intentional with the way the budget is going forward. And I would also be interested in looking at what that gap is looking like with FTEs and our enrollment. And because I know last year we talked briefly on that, but to see how that's been updated from one year to the next, I would be interested in that information as well.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. We will go ahead and continue. Our next item is an update on the district's investment program for the second quarter of FY 2025. And Ms. Apodaca, you have the floor here.
Thank you so much. I will hand it over to Mark Turnbull.
Madam Chair, members of the board, Superintendent Dr. Blakey. Again, this is an investment update for the second quarter of fiscal year 2025 for the investment program for the district. So if you notice in your documents you have for this item, there's an investment summary. Some highlights from that summary: the district was primarily invested in U.S. Treasury and agency bonds that quarter. Book yield of the portfolio decreased from 4.8% to 4.41%. Interest earnings were at 7.3 million compared to 9.5 million the last quarter. Money market funds were at approximately 170 million as compared to 291 million last quarter. Government investment pool increased from 180 million to 161 million. And treasury investments were at approximately 327 million as compared to 243 million. And there's some other information from our investment advisors in that packet. So with that, I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Members of the committee, do we have any questions related to this item? Okay, I see none. Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll go ahead and continue. Our next item is a discussion for operational at-risk and Title I fund allocation for change of schools. And our presenter for this is Ms. Apodaca and Dr. Blea, who is our Executive Director of Federal and State Programs. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair Romero Tapia. This item is to discuss how we have changed at-risk and Title I fund allocation. This is one of the major changes in the budget that has been done previously to really address the guardrails and the goals, particularly looking at guardrails 1 and 4. This is looking at how we can make sure that we're giving the allocations of support in order for schools in priority and emerging schools, particularly to meet those guardrails and to make sure that we are following the performance framework on how we distribute our resources. So as you may recall, this year we created the Office of Federal and State Programs, which has significantly changed the way that we watch for duplication of services and that we are distributing funds from a district level instead of a department level. And so in this presentation and the information you've received, you will see how we have significantly changed the allocations for Title I and at-risk funds to meet the goals and the guardrails through our performance framework. So with that, I turn it over to Ms. Apodaca and Dr. Blea. Ms. Apodaca, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Superintendent, Board Member Romero, and fellow board members. This work actually started with your work. So your work with the communities and having the community meetings and listening about equitable resources started us to see how we could do that. We did work with ERS, Educational Resource Strategies, and they took a deep dive into our finances to help identify where we could do changes. They did a presentation to the board at that time, and in all of their work, they were able to identify operational at-risk funds and the title funds as the only funds that really had flexibility. So taking the work that they did and working with our staff, we came up with these changes. It was done not just by looking and being able to do different levels and levers and different amounts, and then looking at the results and seeing kind of the impact. And we did that for many months for many different models. And then we were able to bring the recommendations that we saw that would make the difference and support what the board is trying to do to cabinet. And cabinet also looked at it with the superintendents and being able to pinpoint what you have before you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Blea so she can talk about kind of her process with Title I.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Superintendent Blakey. You will see in your packet on the top part of the page is our current practice with Title I allocations, and that has been the practice for several years. This year, we raised the poverty threshold. So every year at the 80-day count, we look and have what's called a direct certification process, and we determine how many students are eligible for Title I funding. That then delivers a percentage per school. So in the past, schools that had a 50% or higher threshold, poverty threshold, were funded school-based in Title I. This year, we raised the poverty threshold to 60%. So any school who has a 60% or higher student poverty rate was funded or allocated, school-based Title I funds. The other major difference is that schools identified as priority on the performance framework are now going to be given off the top 3 FTE in order to do the work of transforming schools. That includes a transformational coach, a community school coordinator, and a student success systems coordinator. Additionally, schools identified as emerging on the performance framework are going to be given a transformational coach. Priority and emerging schools were also given title funds, additional funds for Genius Hour, for high dosage tutoring, and for high quality professional development. The other major change is that the per pupil allocation drastically increased. So every student, every student is equal to $777. So that significantly increased the amount of money that is given to schools, again, 60% or higher poverty threshold. And with that, we stand for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Blea. Before I have my questions, I will throw it up to the committee members to see if you have any questions related to the presentation.
I don't have any questions right now, but I think that this is really fantastic, and I thank you all for working so hard on this, and I look forward to the results.
Thank you, Member Benavides. Member Dominguez.
Likewise, I'd like to echo that congratulatory statement from Board Member Benavides. I know that this is, I heard, if I'm correct, that there were many models that were that y'all ran to figure out what was the best change. My first question is, and forgive me, you might have answered it in the Q&As. So will all 12 priority schools get the additional FTE, the 3 additional FTE? Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, you are correct. All priority schools receive the 3 additional FTE off the top.
Okay. And I know that this is going to be hard on other schools. Particularly in my district, I hear a lot of, well, we have Title I kids too. And yes, and there's not enough, and we're not funded for everybody as we should be. I hope that's a correct statement. So what are the implications for other schools that do not meet that 60%? Are they losing all their Title I monies?
Member Dominguez, members of the board, Superintendent Blakey, any school who is not 60% or higher is not going to receive school-based Title I funds. That doesn't mean that they don't receive grant funds and title funds in other ways. And an example is all elementary schools will receive a 1.0 behavior redirector. Right now, schools have to have a population of 500 or higher to receive that. So that's significant because there are many elementary schools that are smaller that are seeing a need for additional support for student behavior. So school-based Title I funds is what we're talking about here. It doesn't mean that those schools are without any title funds specifically. They just don't have the Title I allocation at the school level.
Okay, and that's a nuance that's hard to know unless you're here hearing the presentation. So are there other of those nuanced before I forget this question. Are there schools who through some calculation, particularly priority schools, that actually show more than 100% need of Title I funds? Is there a calculation out there that shows that?
Member Dominguez, members of the board, Superintendent Blakey, yes. So what we do with the direct certification is there's a 1.6% multiplier, and this is a little technical, but what that means is that it accounts for students and families who may not have submitted documentation that would get them qualified under direct certification. So there's wiggle room. So yes, there are schools who have a poverty threshold higher than 100%. As far as priority schools, there are some priority schools in that area, but the poverty threshold is just based on the direct certification numbers and not necessarily on the performance framework. So while there is some overlap, that would just be happenstance. It wouldn't be anything other than those students who qualified as direct certification. I hope that answers your question.
Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, that's a good question. And to reiterate what Dr. Blea said, because there are schools, 50% implies like when we think about it, that means half, but it actually isn't half because the poverty level is so high over 100% that when you get to 60%, that's actually more looking at what we would think of 50%, because there are schools, like you pointed out, that are over the 100% poverty level. The other thing to really point out with these questions, Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, with these funds, is that these are soft funds that are dependent on federal dollars. So the schools know that too, that this is not guaranteed money for next school year. And so that is why we are advocating for this funding, particularly with the federal government, because if it does not go through, then all of what we're talking about would not exist for next school year. So this is really tangible on what the Title I and Medicaid dollars are used for. And if we do lose the money, then what you're hearing today we would have to come back and change that. This wouldn't exist.
Which segues into the next question, and how is the district preparing for the tenuous, I'm going to remain hopeful, but for the tenuous situation that we find ourselves in? I mean, have you run models that without this money?
Madam Chair and Board Member Dominguez, without the money, none of this would exist. So it's kind of like a all or nothing. So we would be unable to supplement the level of support with these funds. So if the funding were to go away, then we could not provide this through our operational dollars. As you'll see in the rest of the budget, that is all earmarked for the classroom and classroom teachers and PTR that we wouldn't be able to go against. So without it, then the people attached to, because a lot of the money we put in, even in the Title I and Medicaid, are people, as Dr. Blea said, they're redirectors, transformational coaches, community school coordinators. So we would not be able to fund these positions without the federal dollars.
So how many are we talking about there? How many positions?
We could get you the exact amount, but it's a lot, because the redirector is 1.0 for every elementary school. So I would guesstimate. I haven't had my coffee, so I might be really off. About 300 positions, just school-based. But then, as Dr. Blea mentioned, we also have department-based support for Title I. So there would be, but we could get you a better number of how many positions are funded. Dr.
An
Blea,
estimate.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
I'm probably underestimating, but significantly, according to Dr. Blea's face.
Yeah. That's a recurring. I was at the Art is Elementary event, and a lot of concern about how I mean, I remain hopeful. I just tell people there's an assumption that it has already trickled down to us. Um, and I'm saying I don't believe so. I think there are good people fighting the good fight in Washington, and you can do the same too. So, but there is that rumble, right? That fear that people funded with federal money, they're going to lose their jobs.
Right, and I think just to stay on what we're talking about here, I'm hopeful too that Superintendent Blakey and the team will keep us in close contact if anything is actually impacted and what we need to do to make decisions moving forward. Board Member Dominguez, any other questions?
I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have two questions for you all. And my first one is this alignment that you presented today associated with the conversations that we had several months ago, I think even over a year ago. So before Dr. Blakey, you were superintendent, where we had asked about what programs we need to take a deep dive on what programs were actually effective, what we needed to make some changes on. And I don't remember the term because I remember Board Member Jackson even specifically asking in our committee meetings and as meetings as a whole, if we were ever going to get a report on that. Is this aligned with those questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee, yes, and there's more to it. I don't know if Dr. Gonzalez is on, but this is kind of the first phase. So Dr. Blea has been able to look for what we say is like duplication of services. And so that's kind of the first phase, is how she's been able to find like misalignment in how we're distributing resources or duplication, and be able to be more strategic about it. Coupled with that, Dr. Gonzalez is working on a return on investment research study. So I don't know, Dr. Gonzalez, do you want to speak quickly on that?
Yes, good morning, Chair Romero, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. The words of return on investment, return on learning, and duplication of efforts have rung in our ear since that meeting you're citing. And one of the things that's a tangible is the establishment of the Federal and State Programs Office. I hope you are seeing some alignment within the context of this very presentation, as well as knowing that we are working diligently to evaluate programs to ensure return on learning, which is another way of saying return on investment. Are we seeing the return on student outcomes based on the expenditures monetarily that we are expending? For example, right now, we do have an outside contractor evaluating some of our programs to report back to us the way we are, for example, executing intervention programs within reading and math. So a great amount of money is being used to intervene and support students. But are these programs working? Are they yielding the outcomes we need? So I'm excited about that as an example. There are other examples that are in the works, and we are really working to maximize the funds that we have, both operationally and federally and state monies. So I'm happy to talk about this, but that's just a taste or an appetizer of the initial work.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. I'm eager to hear, because I think this was a conversation we've had multiple times, and I love to hear that you all are making progress and actually have made some significant change and updates on this. Thank you. My second question is a little bit to the first part, what Board Member Dominguez was asking, and it's more in relation to the schools where their budgets adjusted in the opposite direction of not receiving some of these funds. I was curious, how have the principals been proactive to work with, making these adjustments for their schools? How is that affecting them? And overall, what is the morale of our team, moving forward with the lack of these funds for them?
Chair Romero, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey, that's a fair question, and change is hard. And one thing that I can say is, since the very beginning of the school year, we rolled out the performance framework. and we shared the construct or the tiers, the system of support we're going to use to support schools. So it became something tangible, if you will. And then as the months went by, we began to connect it to student outcomes. So we began to connect it to our scorecard, the outcomes that we're seeing within our school. At the beginning of this year, this calendar year, we shared with them the parameters of how we are going to build the budget. So it became even more profound or even more real. But nothing's real until you get your budget. And that happened a few weeks ago. So right now we've had several support sessions. One is most recent as yesterday to help principals conceptualize the how they can build their budget, how they can incorporate some of the pieces, for example, at priority schools, the 3 positions, into their work on the daily basis. We also have our assistant superintendents working on overdrive to support on individual conversations with our principals, because change in the way that things have happened in the past is something that deserves conversations and deserves an answer to the why. And although we've been giving that in the general sense, we noticed that individual conversations and brainstorming is really important with our individual site principals at the site level. So we are also keeping notes in terms of a principal advocating, you know what, I got my budget, I realize this performance framework, I recognize that there's been a change, but I need this to really make it work. So we have that list, and we're working on really being intentional, going back to the whole conversation of return on learning, to see exactly, okay, you need this, let's have a conversation, let's justify the why, and then we'll make decisions based on what we do have put away for that. So it's a multi-pronged approach of support, but I would just end by saying that the very essence of this support is the system of support which brought us to this place to fund in this manner. So I hope that's a little bit of an answer to your question.
No, that's fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. And again, I'll commend you all, Dr. Blakey, and your team. I love the forward thinking and how we're being proactive versus reactive. So great job. Thank you. Thank you.
Madam Chair, coupled with what Dr. Gonzalez said, just to add real quickly, the performance framework also is, yes, schools on priority and emerging will get more money, but it's tagged for specific things. And so I know that's something the board had brought up too, is like, why is money left on the table? Or so this money is like for specific things that they have to use connected to our 6 promising practices. The schools that are in the acceleration and distinction, while they might get less of the funds, their funds are more unrestricted. So they can have these a community school coordinator, transformational coach. They don't have to, but with their funds are more unrestricted in how they're able to use the money that they get. Whereas the schools in the priority and emerging, while they get more, they're tagged for these specific items that Dr. Blea mentioned.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Blakey, for that explanation. Okay, we will go ahead and continue. So our next item is a discussion of student enrollment projections and methodology. Our presenter for this is Ms. Apodaca, and I'm sure Mr. West will be joining as well to give all his insight. But Ms. Apodaca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Madam Chair, board members, Superintendent Blakey. One of the items also that we worked on this year is we wanted to make sure that we were using a good methodology to predict the enrollment for the next year. And we intentionally wanted to find a way to find the correct number that would be the less disruption to schools. You know, in finance, we recognized that how important this number is in staffing and ultimately for student outcomes, that we have less disruption. So we went to our experts. We went to SAPR and we discussed this enrollment projection, and we're able to work with them to be able to use this methodology that we, like I said, our intent is to try to have less disruption. So I do have Chris West on the call if you wanted to talk a little bit about this methodology.
Good morning, board members, as well as Dr. Blakey. So the method that we chose is something that's called a survival ratio. And I don't know who's controlling the slides, but if you could advance, I can use the slides to help explain it a little bit. There we go. So just like Ms. Apodaca just said, we tried to find a method that would limit disruption. So the whole approach here, the idea is that we're trying to, in the past, what we have done is we've staffed schools based on how they looked this year or the prior year, and then we do this thing as a kind of like a compliance window. By the 20th day of school, we look to see whether we are meeting the state statutes in terms of the, especially in kindergarten, first, second, third, early grades, there's a number of students that you have to have, which equate to a number, either a full-time teacher or a full-time teacher with an education assistant, a full-time education assistant, or having 2 classrooms. So there are these set classroom sizes that we have to do. And in the past, what we have done is we kind of wait till that happens. And then a lot of times we have to take away a person and move them to another school or add a person. So we tried to find an approach that we thought would be less disruptive. So that way parents and the students, they come in, they meet their teacher, and that's their teacher, and they go forward. Because I mean, you all can imagine, and I've heard lots of anecdotes, obviously, from principals over year. It's difficult when you have to move stuff around once you get going. So what we did is we used 3 years of prior data to then try to predict what will happen next year. And then if you go to the next slide, please. So it's called a cohort survival method. So a lot of things that you guys will see usually comes from health. So the idea here is we're trying to look, and please grant me some graces. I use the terminology that's used because it doesn't sound good when you talk about kids. But the idea is you're looking for the number of kids who survive. Again, please grant me grace there. From one grade to the next. So what we do is and for our kindergarten, so we always take the lowest grade. So for example, for our elementary schools, we take the kindergarten. So the kindergarten, they're funded the same way based on the kindergarten students they had this year. So we say, well, the closest we can get to figuring out what next year will happen is what happened this year. And why is that? Because of birth rates, because of school choice, because of all different things, it's really hard to get the kindergarten number right. So instead of trying to predict that number, we just say, you know what, we're just going to keep you the same way you've experienced this year. So we try to keep that less disruptive as possible. Obviously, if more kindergartners show up, then they will have to get more staff or more FTE, but we try to keep it as stable as possible. So again, we also do that in middle school. So middle school, we use the 6th grade, so 6th to 8th. And then in high school, we use the 9th grade. So that whole idea is we generally find that people will start and then they'll go through the entire grades. Usually if people are choosing to go to a school that might not be in their home zone area, they'll still do the same thing. They'll say, okay, my kid's going to middle school next year and I'd like to see what's available and find a school that fits the needs of my child, and they'll put them in 6th grade, right? And then keep them 6th to 7th, 8th grade. Because we all know we try to do less disruptions for ourselves as adults, but also as our kids. So here it is, survival ratios. So we look, for instance, so I talked about kindergarten. So we say, okay, so the denominator is the number of kindergartners there. So if we had 100 kindergartners, then we look to see what happened the next year. So we say, okay, how many 1st graders were there the next year? And it's just a ratio. So if you have everybody stayed there from kindergarten to 1st grade, it would be 1 or 100%. If 10 students left, it would be 90%. So the whole idea is we're doing that across grades. And then we do a 3-year ratio to try to take into account any big changes. And if you've been in the classroom before or worked with schools for a long time, which you guys have, you'll know that there'll be sometimes these big groups that'll come through due to whatever's going on in the world at the time. Like we did have a little bit of bump from COVID, I think from people being home for a little bit. But anyway, the idea is the 3-year ratio smooths that out. Could you go to the next slide, please? So here's just an example. Like I said, I think my example was probably easier than what I'm looking at on the screen. So, but again, I tried to show one that was I used a real school. So this is Comanche Elementary School. So I was showing you guys here, for instance, how we calculated one of their survival ratios. So We looked at the number of kids that showed up in their school on the 80th day, or sorry, that were enrolled in their school on the 80th day for first grade, which was 41 kids. And then we looked the year prior to see how many students were in kindergarten. And then that ratio, because they're less less first graders than there were kindergartens the year prior, that's why we get that 0.953 or 95%. If you go to the next slide, please. And then, so what we do, and I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but the idea here is that this is what's done for every single school. So for Comanche, there you go. We did that change, right? So we did it for kindergarten for 3 years, first grade to second grade, second to third, third to fourth, and then fourth to fifth. So you see how there's a ratio calculated for every single time. And then that last column is just the 3-year average. So if you were to look at Comanche, you can see that Comanche tends to go down a little bit from kindergarten to first grade. So there's a little bit of movement going on there. That's why their ratio is 0.927. But then you see that they do get a bump. So there's something that happens where people then come into first grade there, and those kids stay to second grade. It's a little bit of movement again, and so forth. So you see it kind of goes up and down. But the idea here is that we're trying to create an accurate measure of what goes on in the school over a 3-year period. So that way we kind of have an idea of that we're kind of smoothing out any types of bumps. So that was applied to every school. And it's a change. So we've had to, or not we had to, sorry. SAPR's been, you know, we get requests and then we make sure that we show them the numbers. And the idea is that the numbers are public so everybody can do the same thing with us. Because always our goal is always to be transparent, because if we all are using the same tools and able to ask each other for help and questions, then we can all do things together because we're on the same page. Can you go to the next slide, please? Or do I have a next slide? I'm not sure if I don't know if I do. Is that the end? Okay, that's the end. Okay, so that's how the method works. So thank you, Renette.
Thank you. And, you know, as I mentioned before, this is our attempt to try to get it as accurate as we can, because our goal is definitely for student outcomes and not have disruption for the students and the families.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Apodaca. And this is exactly what I was referring to at the beginning. I'm really interested in diving into this just to see how FTEs align with our enrollment. So thank you. Members of the committee, any questions related to this presentation? Okay.
I do have a question.
Go ahead, Member Dominguez.
I'm having a hard time clicking on those little icons. So yeah, I love the system, right? Like you said, Mr. West, that it's transparent. It takes the average over 3 years by grade level. And so I get that you're trying to mitigate any severe outcome with an average. And yet, I say this as a former educator, classroom educator, sometimes things don't pan out in the classroom. And so while this is true and it looks good to me, I know that between the numbers and the reality, sometimes there are disconnects. And so what potential, two questions. What potential disconnects are there that you can foresee? And two, have you talked to boots on the ground, school sites, teachers to get feedback, to lessen the disconnect, if you will?
Sure, Madam Chair, Board Member Dominguez. Yes, this is just an attempt to get closer, but it's not 100% that this is exactly what is going to be in the classroom. What we do know in talking to families and teachers is that it's very disruptive when we have to change classes around in the fall. Will we still have to an extent? Yes. What we're trying to do is lessen the extent of mobility in the 20th day count as to our classes being more at a true number so that it lessens the disruption. It won't be 100%. We expect we will have to move things around. Particularly, we would have to move schools that we would always have to if they're over enrolled. So if they're out of compliance, we always have to give FTE to make sure that they're in compliance. We're also, if they're under enrolled, then we kind of look to see, do we have enough to balance on the other side? But if not, the money has to come from somewhere where that's where you have to shift it around on the other side. So it's an attempt to get a closer accuracy so there's less disruption. But we'll see, you know, what happens in the fall if we were able to lessen the disruption. But really what we're trying to do is have less change for students the first 20 days of school. It's always really hard when they get attached to their teachers or their schedule, that then their schedule has to change. And we have to because they're out of compliance. So we're just trying to get a little bit better at how accurate we can be with it.
Thank you. And one more follow-up. So if we're trying to lessen the mobility at the 20-day count, but you have to, I mean, if you have to make those adjustments, I'm trying to remember how long it took to have the dust settle, so to speak, to make those adjustments. Those adjustments happened by what, the 80th? No.
We make the adjustments. Go ahead, Renette. Were you going to?
Board Member Dominguez, Board Member Superintendent Blakey, we use the 20th day as the compliance date that we are making changes, and we're able to see what, like you said, what the reality is. In my experience, what I've seen is it usually goes to about Labor Day, and a little bit after Labor Day, we start to see things settle. And then sometimes we do have spring compliance. So after the holidays, when we start the next semester, sometimes we do see some compliance issues at that time too, that we definitely will address. And again, you know, for it to settle and for the students to finish the school year.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Anything else before we move on? Okay, thank you. So thank you for that presentation. We will continue. So our next item is to consider approval of the January 2025 interfunction transfers for grant budget. And Ms. Apodaca, you have the floor here.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Romero, board members and superintendent. I do have Mihaela on the call to present this item.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board, Superintendent Blakey, presenting for your consideration of approval the grant management interfunction transfers for the month of January 2025. It is composed of regular alignments to program needs with nothing out of the ordinary, and I stand for questions.
Thank you. Any questions related to this item? Okay, I see none. And board members, thank you for being patient. I know we had a lot of presentations today that we usually don't, but the other items should be pretty normal. So we will go ahead and continue. Our next item is to consider approval of January 2025 intra-function transfers for grant budget, and I will turn it back over to y'all.
Thank you, Mihaela.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the board, Superintendent Blakey, presenting for your consideration of approval the intra-function budget transfers for grant management for January 2025. We have some salary alignments to actual expenses in major funds like Medicaid and pre-K as the most voluminous transfers, which is considered routine maintenance throughout the year. and along with some routine program alignment transfers. Other than that, I did not see anything out of the ordinary, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Members of the committee, any questions related? Okay, thank you so much. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of the January 2025 interfunction transfers for all non-categorical funds. And our presenter for this is Ms. Hicks, I assume. I see her pop on.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. This agenda item requests your approval of 12 interfunction budget transfers in the operational fund totaling $397K. 4 out of the 12 transfers use at-risk funds and the remaining 8 use general funds.
Thank you. Members of the committee, any questions related to this item? Okay, thank you. I see none. We will go ahead and continue. Our next item is to consider approval of the January 2025 intra-function transfers for all non-categorical funds. And Ms. Hicks, the floor is yours again.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. This agenda item requests your approval of intra-function budget transfers for all non-categorical funds totaling $3.1 million in operational funds, $319K in ad valorem, which is property tax funds, $3,000 in facility enterprise funds, and $1.4 million in capital funds.
Thank you, Ms. Hicks. Members of the committee, any questions on this item? Okay, thank you. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of the distribution of capital improvement tax levy receipts to charter schools, and this is in accordance with 22-25-27C. And Mr. Jaquez will be our presenter for this item, and the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Dr. Blakey. APS had a tax question for a levy which voters approved in November of 2023. And this approval should have included language that included charter schools as part of that distribution. APS has worked with New Mexico PED and our counsel, legal counsel, in righting that wrong. And what you have before you is a document that would do that. If approved, then we would move forward with a formula to work through those and correct that omission. And with that, Madam Chair, we stand for any questions.
Thank you. Members of the committee, I actually do see a question. I'll turn it over to Board Member Dominguez.
So really, we're out of compliance. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so so the vote is really, do we want to, are we going to approve being out of compliance, or are we going to vote for getting it right?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Chair, Board Member Dominguez. So this gets us back in alignment with state statute and gets us back in compliance.
I think it's going to be important to stress that
Yes, ma'am.
when I saw that I don't have the document in front of me, but when I saw that it was a New Mexico statute, I thought, well, we really have no business not approving this.
Would be appreciated. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I see none. Thank you, Mr. Jaquez. We'll go ahead and continue. Our next item is consideration for approval of annual cash balance increases and decreases. And Ms. Apodaca, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey, this item is truing up our cash. So when we submit our budget, as you know, we submit it before the end of the year. So we have an estimate of what we think the ending cash will be. However, there is, of course, business that's done between that time. So what this does is it trues up what we projected our ending cash would be, what it actually was on 6/30. So that's what this approval is for. I also have Ms. Hicks on here if you have anything to add.
No, that was perfect.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Apodaca. Members of the committee, do we have any questions on this item? Okay, thank you so much. I see none, so we will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditures that equals or exceeds $500,000, and this is for diesel fuel for student transportation. And our presenter on this is Mr. Binns. I will turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Dr. Blakey, consider approval of the district purchase or expenditures equals or exceeds 500,000 to purchase diesel fuel for student transportation. Recently, Brewer Oil back in December sold out to Equilon, and that's who we use for our card lock system. So it's not additional funds, it's just changing the PO from Brewer to Equilon, and I stand for any questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Binns. Members of the committee, any questions? Okay, thank you. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This is for architectural services on call. And our presenter for this is Ms. Gensler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I'm requesting consideration for approval for the purchase of architectural services on call. This is based on an RFP. The estimated cost is $10 million for 4 years using capital, operational, and federal funds. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you. Members of the committee, any questions on this item? Okay, thank you so much. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This is to purchase high-quality instructional materials for middle and high school social studies. And Dr. Gonzalez, I believe it's you. Thank you.
Madam Chair Romero, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey, as you know, we have recently purchased high-quality instructional materials in the area of English, ELA, and math. This is a request to do the same with social studies. I am joined by Chief Academic Officer Sherry Jett, and I believe our Director of Instructional Materials, Rachel Altabelli. Very proud of the inclusive process that we've built over time to get community teacher input in regards to our selection and recommendation. We stand for your questions and seek approval.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Members of the committee, any questions related to this item? Okay, I see none. Thank you. We will go ahead and continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditures that equals or exceeds $500,000. This is also to purchase high school quality instructional materials for 8th grade health. And Dr. Gonzalez, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, Tapio Romero, members of the committee, Dr. Blakey, similar to the previous item, we're changing the request from social studies to health to continue the work around high quality instructional materials in this content area. We seek your approval and stand for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Members of the committee, any questions?
I do have a question.
Go ahead, Board Member Dominguez.
Lots of concern over, the appropriateness of what will be taught at eighth grade. And so how are we, it's a perception issue. And so what are we doing to mitigate or to lessen concerns about what 8th graders are ready to learn and what's appropriate for them to learn?
Madam Chair, Tapio Romero, Member Dominguez, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey, a couple of things. We did have a committee of multiple stakeholders that informed our recommendation and where we are in terms of next year in relationship to the new high school graduation requirements. We also recognize the importance of being proactive in our approach with preparing our middle school students for the rigors of the credit. We know that there have been several examples throughout the years where our students come to 9th grade and they do not have the concept of what a high school credit is, and it translates into a 9th grade year of struggle, which puts them behind. So the opportunity for us to be proactive in the 8th grade was an opportunity to enhance what's already being done in the area of Algebra 1. We have a couple of sessions coming up this spring with our health educators, as well as our teachers in the area of personal financial literacy, where we are going to work with them as a specific and targeted cohort to understand the nuance, the instructional methodology, the frameworks, the units of study, the instructional materials, and so on. But we also recognize that the support needs to be ongoing. I'd like to defer to our Chief Academic Officer, Sherry Jett, who I'm sure has more information in relationship to the why and the support.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Chair Tapia Romero and members of the committee, Superintendent Dr. Blakey, I really appreciate the question just in terms of the perception that, eighth grade is maybe different than ninth grade. And we are working really hard with these teachers, as Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, in order to set up professional learning opportunities. So there is a nuanced approach because we do want to be sensitive to, what is perceived, I think, as an age gap between the 8th and 9th grader. In addition, we are also looking at, we're actually in the process of rewriting that course framework so that it is actually very appropriate to the 8th grade. I think what's really important is to recognize we're not just picking up 9th grade curriculum and dropping it on 8th graders, but rather we're being really thoughtful about the approach.
Thank you. Any other questions on this item? Okay, we will go ahead and continue. Thank you for that. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This one is for roofing supplies, and our presenter for this is Ms. Gensler. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I'm requesting consideration for approval for the purchase of roofing supplies. The procurement method was a bid. Estimated cost is $923,000 over a 4-year period using SB 9, HB 33 operational funds and capital funds. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions on this item? Okay, I see none. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This is for E-Rate Phase 5 network switch and Wi-Fi AP licenses and software. And our presenter for this, actually, I'll turn it right back to you, Ms. Gensler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I'm requesting consideration and approval for the purchase of E-Rate Phase 5 network switch and Wi-Fi AP licenses and software. This was based on an RFP as a procurement method. Estimated cost is $7.3 million, utilizing federal funds, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions related? I see none. Thank you. We will continue. Our next item is to consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This one is for manufacturer processing and USDA commodities. And Ms. Gensler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I'm requesting consideration for approval of the purchase of manufacturer processing USDA commodities. This is a multi-award based on an RFP. The estimated cost is $7 million for a 1-year contract using federal funds.
Thank you.
Questions.
Thank you. Members of the committee, any questions? Okay, I see none. We will continue. Our next item is consider approval of district purchase or expenditure that equals or exceeds $500,000. This one is for office and school supplies on demand for warehouse stock. And Ms. Gensler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I'm requesting consideration and approval for the purchase of office and school supplies for our on-demand warehouse stock based on a bid. The estimated purchase is $1.12 million using capital and operational funds, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Members of the committee, any questions? Okay, I see none. We will continue. This is our last item. Our item is to consider approval of the January 2025 cash disbursements. And Ms. Gensler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Superintendent Blakey. I am requesting approval of the January 2025 cash disbursements. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Members of the committee, any questions? Okay, thank you so much. So our next item now is to consider recommending consent agenda board approval on items discussed during the February 26, 2025 Finance Committee meeting. These include the January 25 2025 grant and budget inter and intra-function transfers, the distribution of capital improvement tax receipts to charter schools, the annual cash balances increases and decreases, the district purchase or expenditures that equals or exceeds $500,000, which are included in the following: the diesel fuel for student transportation, architectural services, high-quality instructional materials for middle and high school students for social studies and health, roofing supplies, E-rate Phase 5 network switch and Wi-Fi AP licenses and software, manufacturer processing for USDA commodities, and office and school supplies on demand for warehouse stock. And finally, the January 2025 cash disbursements. May I have a motion and a second?
This is Josefina, or Board Member Dominguez, and I move to recommend for consent agenda and board approval of items as listed by Chair Tapia Romero.
And I'll second. This is Board Member Benavides.
Thank you. Dr. Albright, may I have a roll call, please?
Heather Benavides,
Yes.
Josefina Dominguez,
Yes.
Crystal Tapia Romero.
Yes, thank you so much. So our next Finance Committee meeting will be March 26, 2025 at 8 a.m. virtually, or you may watch on the APS Board of Education YouTube channel. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.